I don't care if it calls for a recorded vote. That's great. That's not my problem. Quorum being present, the Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Committee's meeting today for consideration of H.R. 6349, Preventing Adversaries from Developing Critical Capabilities Act, H.R. 533, Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Conflict Act, H.R. 2766, the Uyghur Policy Act of 2023, H.R. 5375, Strengthening the Quad Act, H.R. 1103, Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act, and H.R. 5532, Russia-North Korea Cooperation Sanctions Act. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled. He may recess the committee at any point without objections so ordered. Pursuant to House rules, I request that members have the opportunity to submit views for any committee report that may be produced on any of today's measures. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6349, Preventing Adversaries from Developing Critical Capabilities Act. The bill was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6349, to prohibit or require notification with respect to certain activities of United States persons involving countries of concern and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a statement in support of the bill. We are facing a generational threat from the Chinese Communist Party. Make no mistake, the Chinese Communist Party is preparing to fight a war over Taiwan. Its Navy is illegally claiming the South China Sea and ramming the shipping vessels of our allies. Its security services are using facial recognition, AI, and biometric data to suppress religious and ethnic minorities. I find it troubling that the United States does not currently restrict American investment dollars into sectors that support these activities. But we can. We can restrict China's access to technology through export controls. But we can't stop an investor from using their know-how, network, and money to build a CCP giant. And this needs to stop. Today, we will pass the strongest bill to counter the CCP that I've seen in my tenure on this committee and in Congress. And I'd like to especially thank the ranking member, Mr. Meeks, for working with me and leading with me on this bill. We built quite a coalition together as one nation with one voice. In addition to our support, the leads on the Select Committee on China also back this bill. The administration obviously supports outbound investment restrictions, as reflected in the recent executive order that I was pleased to see after working with the Director Estevez of BIS and Secretary Raimondo. And so do many conservative groups, including Heritage, Hudson, and American Compass. But I know one group that really hates this bill, and that's the Chinese Communist Party. And that's because this effort targets specific technology sectors like AI and quantum computing that are empowering China's military development and surveillance state. The sector-based forward-looking approach is the path forward. We've seen time and again the shortcomings of targeting companies one by one. They simply change the names of their companies. That backwards-looking process has failed and only strengthened the CCP. Our approach, on the other hand, is comprehensive and preventative. We know that in these high-tech dual-use sectors, more U.S. investment only harms national security. Whether it's $1 or $1 billion, U.S. investors should not be involved in these high-tech areas that will shape and define the future. What we have here is truly a bipartisan piece of legislation that should be expedited immediately to the House floor. Indeed, this type of forward-looking outbound framework is supported by nearly every senator. My dear friend, Senator Cornyn, has a similar bill which got over 90 votes in the Senate. And it may not be allowed to pass on the National Defense Authorization Bill, but we will pass it out of this committee, and we will pass it out on the House floor, and we will send it to the Senate, and they will pass it, and it will be signed into law by the President of the United States. For it seems like nearly the entirety of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, agree that U.S. dollars and investment shouldn't be supporting the CCP's development of critical technologies. The time now calls for bold, new ideas instead of old, failed approaches. Today, I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this measure to take the steps necessary to maintain the global balance of power. With that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I strongly support this measure, and I'm proud to be co-leading it with Chairman McCaul. Our staffs have worked tirelessly together for several weeks to carefully draft and negotiate this bill. And I am so pleased that we were able to reach an agreement on such significant legislation. This has been a completely bipartisan effort. And I again thank Chairman McCaul for his partnership to address a critical challenge. American dollars should not fund the development of critical technologies that could threaten our national security if acquired by our competitors. To deal with this threat, this past August, President Biden, for the first time, initiated a program to prohibit or require notifications for certain outbound financial investments by the United States persons into the semiconductor, quantum, and artificial intelligence sectors in China. And since President Biden issued his executive order, the administration indicated it could most effectively start and implement such a program if it was codified in law. Now, there have been several bipartisan, bicameral efforts in recent years, for example, by Senators Casey and Cornyn, and by Representatives DeLauro and Pascal, among others, to establish an outbound investment program. But our bill, H.R. 6349, builds on these efforts by codifying the Biden executive order and enhancing the program and regulations already being developed by the administration. What we did, we incorporated administration's feedback to make the bill stronger. Importantly, we've authorized resources and provided hiring authority to ensure that the administration has the resources and staff needed to get this program running quickly and effectively. We've also ensured that violations of outbound restrictions can be enforced through penalties. And we closed loopholes that would prevent U.S. companies from evading restrictions through their subsidiaries abroad. Finally, we've built upon the executive order in two other critical ways. First, we've expanded the outbound restrictions beyond the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, and Macau to cover Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Second, we have added hypersonics and high-performance computing to the covered sectors to ensure that we are maximizing the protection of our national security, which is front and center for us. And as a member of the Financial Services Committee also, I've long supported U.S. leadership in open, global financial markets. We need to ensure that Americans are engaging in these markets, but this engagement should be done in such a way that does not harm our national security. H.R. 6349 will safeguard our security and sustain U.S. global leadership through limited guardrails and transparency regarding major investments abroad by Americans. And so I close by saying thank you to the chairman again, thank you to the majority staff for working in a way that we could speak again with one voice on this serious matter of defense for our country and security for our country. It is the way things ought to be. I strongly support this bill, and I urge all of my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me echo that sentiment that I want to thank the staff as well for working so well together. I think this could be the strongest countering China bill ever passed by the Congress. And with that, is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Barr is recognized.
I thank the chairman for recognition. I thank him for his patriotic dedication to ensuring that Americans are not unwittingly investing in the Chinese entities that harm our own national security. I want to thank the ranking member also for joining in this very important effort. As a member of both this committee and the House Financial Services Committee, we've also passed legislation in the Financial Services Committee to address this issue. My bill, H.R. 760, the Chinese Military Surveillance Companies Sanctions Act, is all-inclusive. My legislation would impose full blocking sanctions on any defense sector entity in China, including Chinese military and industrial complex companies such as Huawei, Hikvision, SMIC, and SenseTime. It also includes a comprehensive sanctions assessment for Chinese entities listed pursuant to Section 1260H of the FY 2021 NDAA, a report administered by the Secretary of Defense, as well as companies on the entity list and military end user entity list at the Department of Commerce. I stand behind my legislation's approach, which uses existing authorities and agencies via sanctions and OFAC instead of giving the administration broad authority to create new government bureaucracy. The bill before us today is well-intentioned. The bill before us has a good objective, the same objective that mine has. But it does give the president the ability to delegate the new prohibition authority to the head of any federal agency the president determines. And we've seen firsthand the Biden administration overextend their reach into business and the lives of Americans. And respectfully, this authority is not tailored enough. To address the issue of U.S. investments in China, it is a misconception that U.S. investors solely are fueling China's economic growth. There is a problem here. And the chairman's bill and the ranking member's bill seeks to get at it, and I appreciate that. But under Xi's dictatorship, China has attacked Western investment as a threat to the CCP's hold. As a result, foreign direct investment in China is negative for the first time on record, and U.S. venture capital in the country has reached a 10-year low. Far from craving foreign financing, China is the world's largest exporter of capital, which has powered the Belt and Road Initiative and made Beijing the largest official creditor in the world. Its foreign exchange reserves may now reach $6 trillion, double what analysts previously thought. Untailored broad prohibitions would have the unintended consequence of limiting Americans' control, influence, and intelligence gathering in Chinese technology companies. That's not what we want. Think of it this way. The U.S. screens Chinese investments into Silicon Valley startups through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. No one in the CCP is proposing an outbound investment regime that would block Chinese nationals from taking over America's technology innovators. The CCP is brutal, but it is not moronic. It is therefore unclear why the U.S. would want to prevent Americans from going abroad to pry open the world's most opaque major economy. We want Americans on the boards of Chinese companies spreading Western standards and complying with U.S. laws. And so we've got to be careful here. Since China is in no way dependent on U.S. capital alone from U.S. investors, the only way to undermine its military companies is by cutting off revenues and technology, which is the advantage of sanctions. Moreover, unlike unilateral investment measures, sanctions compliance and coordination with friends in the G7 and beyond amplify their impact. Sanctions have a multilateral effect. Alternatively, if the goal of this legislation is simply to target know-how, then U.S. export controls already prohibit knowledge transfer abroad, often in cooperation with our allies. Anyone who claims there's a gap in government authorities doesn't know how the authorities exist, or they find sanctions and export controls too hawkish on China. There's no better example of the effectiveness of sanctions than the Treasury Department's response to H.R. 760. The Treasury Department is concerned that the potential consequences for China from this bill could be quote-unquote catastrophic. Instead, it's opting for an investment notification approach through EO 14105, not unlike requirements of an outbound regime. So the sanctions approach is actually the tough approach. OFAC is the toughest approach, and I stand ready to support strong and effective action that strengthens the U.S. competitive edge against China. I think the chairman's effort is a noble and good one, and this is a very important piece of legislation. I'm glad that the chairman and the ranking member are engaging in this. They've been all along, and this is a patriotic dedication to getting at a problem that we need to get at. And so I appreciate the chairman's work on this. And I encourage all members in all of the committees of jurisdiction, especially Financial Services Committee and this committee and the China Select Committee on which I serve as well, to collaborate going forward and to get a solution and get everybody on the same page, because we all want the same objective here. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Let me echo the same sentiment. I would very much, as we have, I anticipate this will pass out of committee, and I would like to continue working with you, sir, to see if there are ways to reconcile the two bills coming out of both this committee and Financial Services. But I do want to state what this bill does not do. It does not create a bureaucracy. It does not create a CFIUS structure. It simply bars sectors from investing, that being AI, quantum, hypersonics, and semiconductors. All four of those sectors go straight into the Chinese military apparatus. Sanctions, the company can merely change their name, and then it's no longer effective. But if we bar wholesale sectors, we're blocking all national security-related investments in China. That's why Heritage Action said House Republicans should be supporting, not blocking, investment curbs on China, which your bill does as well. And I look forward to working with you. This bill has tremendous support on both sides of the aisle, but also from the most conservative groups. And the people I respect the most, people like Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor O'Brien, who I worked with in the prior administration, and his deputy, Pottinger, Secretary Wilbur Ross. This is one of the top recommendations in the China task force that I chaired. And I'm proud that we finally have brought it to fruition to be marked up by this committee. And we can't take no action on this. And while this may be pulled down by on the NDAA, I don't know, we have a responsibility, not only as members of this committee, but as Americans, to protect the American people from investments that go straight into the Chinese military apparatus. And I thank you for your statement. You started out very perfectly that we both have the same goal. We have the same desire and intent. We may have a different means to get there. And I look forward to working with you as we look towards a bill that can go to the floor where we have consensus. I'll yield.
Would gentlemen yield? Just a real additional question, because I know the chairman shares this sentiment, that this effort is very important because we do need to take defensive actions, whether it's this bill or an OFAC sanctions approach, which could have agility to change and adapt to name changes. But I know the chairman agrees with me that it's not just about defensive measures. It's also about being the best version of ourselves. This is an economic competition with the PRC and the CCP, which means we have an advantage. The advantage that we have is that we are a free market capitalist economy, and they are a closed, central planning-oriented communist country. That is their Achilles heel. So let's be the best version of ourselves, and let's take advantage of the fact that they are the communists, and that is their weakness. And our offensive move is to make sure that we remain a country committed to free market principles. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say congratulations on the new baby. We're all very happy for you. Is there any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion on the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 6349 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 533, promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China Conflict Act. The bill was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 533, to amend the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, to modify certain provisions of that act, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the promoting of resolution to the Tibetan-China Conflict Act. Section 2, findings.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the Meeks Amendment, number 50, in the nature of a substitute circulated to members in advance, shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of the amendment. I now recognize myself in support of this bill. First of all, I want to thank those who have attended that represent the great Tibetan people, the nation that's been oppressed for so many years by the Chinese Communist Party. We welcome you, and we're so glad that we've come to this great day where this committee will pass and move out of this committee this Tibetan resolution that will go to the House floor, pass, and I predict will pass the Senate and be signed into law. And thank you so much for being here. The world is no stranger to the CCP's aggression and excessive claims, and nobody knows that more than the Tibetan people. From ramming Philippine boats to killing Australian servicemen to claiming ownership over Taiwan, the CCP seeks to dominate the entire Indo-Pacific. The CCP has a long and violent record of oppression against the people of Tibet. In October of 1950, Chinese communist troops annexed Tibet, killing tens of thousands of Tibetans and monks. The CCP's ongoing oppression of the people of Tibet ultimately forced the Dalai Lama to flee to India. This persecution has continued to this day. Just last week, the CCP released a white paper on its policies in Tibet. In this document, the party doubles down on its oppression and crackdown on the religious and economic freedom of Tibetan people. Some of the actions taken by the CCP include setting up boarding schools to, quote, re-educate Tibetan children, clamping down on the use of Tibetan language, restricting movement of Tibetans, and even attempting to insert themselves into the secession of the Dalai Lama. Well, thank God the Dalai Lama said that the new Dalai Lama, who will be reborn, will not be born in China. This white paper demonstrates the need for this bill, and I'm proud to have co-introduced it with Representative McGovern. The promoting a resolution to the Tibetan-China Dispute Act helps Tibetans in two major ways. First, it pushes back against CCP propaganda about the history of Tibet. The United States has never accepted that, quote, Tibet was part of China since ancient times, unquote, as the CCP falsely claims. This legislation clarifies U.S. policy, highlights the unique language, religion, and culture of the Tibetan people, and directs U.S. diplomacy to push back against CCP propaganda. Additionally, it ensures Tibetans have a say in their own future, not the CCP. This bill stresses the need for a dialogue between the CCP and the democratically elected leaders of Tibet. Any resolution must include the wishes and the voice of the Tibetan people. Tibetans are a democracy-loving people who wish to practice their own religion freely and have their own wishes and desires acknowledged, as we do in the United States of America. The freedoms that we enjoy, we want to be enjoyed by the people of Tibet. So I'm proud to have played a very small role in part in supporting this dream for the Tibetan people. I want to thank you for being here today. I hope you can be here when it passes on the House floor. I encourage you to relay my best wishes to the Dalai Lama, and I encourage all my colleagues to push back against the crackdown of religious and ethnic minorities like the Tibetan people and vote in favor of this bill. And I also want to thank my good friend again, Mr. Meeks, for working with me to get to this point where we are today. And with that, I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I get started on my remarks, I just want to welcome a new member to our committee, Gabe Amo from Rhode Island, won a special election and has been here. This is his first full committee meeting. He is an individual that is going to add a lot to our committee in the same spirit of what we work in a bipartisan way. He comes well-equipped. He'll sit on all of the subcommittees of which David Cicilline, his predecessor, sat on previously. And I think that you'll find that he will be a huge addition to our committee and working together. And so, Gabe, welcome to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I want to also, as Chairman McCall, welcome the Tibetan people for being here for this long-awaited bill to pass. And like the chairman have said, who's been working on this for a long time, along with Mr. McGovern, that we want to make sure that the message is clear when we talk about freeing people from oppression. And so welcome to the House Foreign Affairs Committee and welcome to the United States House of Representatives. Please send our greetings back to the Dalai Lama. You know, I support this bill that Representative Jim McGovern and Chairman McCall has put forward because for far too long, Beijing has repressed the Tibetan people and shirked its commitments to work with the Dalai Lama and his representatives to resolve the Tibet question through dialogue. I am deeply concerned by the ongoing effort by Beijing to dilute the distinct religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity of the Tibetan people. For example, Beijing is shutting down local schools in Tibetan areas and replacing them with centralized Chinese boarding schools that separate children from their families and communities. Multiple UN special rapporteurs have raised concerns about this forced assimilation, warning that the residential school system appears to, and I quote, appears to act as a mandatory large-scale program intended to assimilate Tibetans into majority Han culture, contrary to international human rights standards, unquote. And while Beijing is engaged in these tactics to suppress Tibetan culture, it has propagated a disinformation campaign about Tibet and its history. And contrary to its commitments, the People's Republic of China has not engaged in a formal dialogue on the Tibet question with the Dalai Lama since 2010. H.R. 533 calls Beijing out on its campaign of repression and its neglect of the aspiration of the Tibetan people. It aims to raise awareness about the suppression of Tibetan identity, language, and culture, and counter the PRC's disinformation efforts aimed at undermining the Tibetan people's aspirations. It reinforces U.S. support for the Tibetan people and calls for a meaningful dialogue between the PRC and Tibetan representatives to reach a negotiated solution on the question of Tibet. Importantly, the bill also amends the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002 by strengthening U.S. public diplomacy efforts countering PRC's disinformation about Tibet. This is an important and very timely measure, and I want to thank Representative McGovern and Chairman McCall for introducing it and for being a long-term champion of the Tibetan people. I also want to thank Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi for her support of this bill and for her long principled conviction to hold the PRC accountable for its human rights violations. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Perry's, I'm sorry, Mr. Smith is recognized.
Very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do rise in strong support of H.R. 533, I should say. And I want to thank Jim McGovern, who is a good friend, you, for sponsoring it, and Mr. Meeks for the amendment in nature of a substitute, and I'm very proud to be one of the co-sponsors of the bill. Tibetan people today face new and worsening challenges from the Chinese Communist Party and their repressive rule. Threats to Tibet's linguistic, religious, and cultural heritage has expanded exponentially in recent years, and now an estimated 80% of all children in the Tibet Autonomous Region are separated from their families and educated in a massive system of colonial boarding schools, a deeply troubling fact about the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to forcibly assimilate non-Han ethnic and religious groups. They are trying to change radically how those young children think about their lives and about their culture and about their faith. In recent years, Chinese police in Tibet have conducted mass DNA collection and iris scanning programs in wide swatches of Tibetan society, including in monasteries and primary schools, a sinister endeavor to harvest biometric data, and one which implicates an American company, Thermo Fisher Scientific. Amid these threats to Tibetans in Tibet, the Chinese Communist Party also seeks to extend its repressive reach abroad, targeting for surveillance and harassment the Tibetan diaspora communities in the United States, India, and in Nepal. The Chinese Communist Party has long engaged in crimes against humanity in Tibet and against Tibetans. I have chaired multiple hearings with my good friend McGovern and on my subcommittee and also on the China Commission. We held one last March, and the title was Preserving Tibet, Combating Cultural Erasure, Forced Assimilation, and Transnational Repression, which featured the Sikyong, the head of the Tibetan government in exile, as well as Richard Gere. And let me tell you, there is no one more passionate and articulate anywhere in the world than Richard Gere for many, many, many years. Countering disinformation and addressing intimidation of Tibetans, transnational repression, thankfully, is a priority of this committee, and I thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. This bill authorizes the State Department to take actions to counter Chinese Communist propaganda directed against Tibet, including about Tibet's history and institutions, and for that reason alone, it should be supported. But during a month when the Atheist Communist Party claims that the Dalai Lama cannot recognize a successor without their approval, this bill is timely and sends the right message that this Congress stands with the Tibetan people and their struggle for freedom and fundamental human rights. And again, I want to thank those who are here today on behalf of the community for their leadership as well. I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Colley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to join in thanking the authors of this bill for bringing it forward. I led the first congressional staff del to Tibet in 1986, and we could witness and did the systematic destruction of Tibetan culture, even though we were under the watchful eyes of handlers from Beijing. Monks at monasteries would come up to us once they knew we weren't Russian and would tell us about the suppression, about the torture, about imprisonment, about the destruction of cultural treasures in Tibet, all designed to impose the Han culture on Tibet. There was also and has been a systematic attempt by the Chinese to repopulate Tibet so that it loses its Tibetan heritage, culture, and distinct identity. A few years ago, I had the privilege of meeting with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala and to see the conditions the Tibetan leadership is sort of forced to live with in exile because the Han forcibly moved them out. Tibet is a distinct culture. It has a distinct identity. I hope someday they'll be able to achieve that distinction with their own independence and autonomy. But I think this bill is an important statement by the Congress, and I'm so pleased to want to vote for it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues for bringing it forward. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I thank you as well. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Perry is recognized.
I thank the chairman and thank the look, miracles never cease. Me and Chairman McGovern on the same side of an issue. It's awesome when that bipartisanship can happen, as the former chairman of this committee also knows. I would say this: I am supportive of this bill, and I appreciate the constant pressure against the Communist Party of China. But I would also say that I would like to see it be much stronger. I think that we ought to open an embassy in Lhasa. I think we ought to recognize the government, the legitimate Tibetan government in exile, and let the Chinese Communist Party know where America truly stands, and that we do not accept what they're doing in Tibet and to the Tibetan people. And not only do we not accept it, we're willing to do something about it. The tough rhetoric is nice, and it is helpful, but it is not enough. And so I hope this is just the beginning and not nearly the end of what we do in regard to supporting the people of Tibet and being opposed to the oppression and the dictatorial measures of the Communist Party of China. And with that, I yield the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the bill? Yeah. The gentleman's recognized from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Mike McCall and Ranking Member Greg Meeks, thank you for bringing this important bipartisan measures that are coming up today before the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I want to especially welcome Congressman Gabe Aimo of Rhode Island with his Liberian heritage. I'm grateful with with Ranking Member Greg Meeks. We all share a South Carolina heritage. All of the legislation before the committee today covers important policy that has a direct impact on American citizens. I'm grateful to be a co-sponsor with Chairman Jim McGovern and Chairman Mike McCall for promoting a resolution on the Tibet-China Conflict Act. This bill pushes for a conversation and resolution to the decades-long illegal occupation of Tibet by the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party dictatorship oppresses the people of China. I personally appreciate the people of China, as my father, First Lieutenant Hugh Wilson, served in the 14th Air Force Flying Tigers, the U.S. Army Air Corps, in World War II, to liberate the people of China as he served in Xi'an, Chengdu, and Kunming. The Dalai Lama has pushed for peace since the 1950 illegal invasion of the sovereign nation of Tibet by dictator Mao Zedong. China proved their intent for not only territorial annexation, but for the greater genocide of Tibetans with the kidnapping of the Panchen Lama at 6 years old, just 3 days after being named to the role in 1995. China has continued their cultural genocide, announcing Tibet does not exist, and pushing for the false name of Xizang. I agree very much with my colleague, Congressman Scott Perry, that this should be the beginning of passage of legislation to stand up for the people of Tibet and stand against the Chinese Communist Party genocide in Tibet. This is, again, just as false of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing today, that Tibet does not exist, as we hear that the 24 million people of Taiwan don't exist either. We should be working together as we face the threats of the dictatorial Chinese Communist Party. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? There being no amendments, I move the committee report H.R. 533 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion reconsiders laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2766, the Uyghur Policy Act of 2023. The bill is circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
HR 2766, to support the human rights of Uyghur and members of the minority groups residing primarily in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the Kim Amendment, number 47, in the nature of a substitute, circulated to members in advance, shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of amendment. Is there any discussion on the bill? I recognize the author, Ms. Kim. I'm sorry. I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I strongly support this bill, and I'm a proud co-sponsor with Ms. Kim, and thank her for her work on this. Congress cannot be silent, and we must act when faced with terrible human rights atrocities around the world. We must come together in a bipartisan fashion to support the Uyghurs and other religious and ethnic minority communities suffering in Xinjiang. As chairman of this committee in the 117th Congress, I was proud to hold a hearing featuring Uyghur survivor, and I can say her heartbreaking testimony stays with me until this very day. And I was proud to work with Chairman McCall to introduce and pass on the House floor a resolution condemning the PRC's genocide in Xinjiang. And I was also proud to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which President Biden signed into law. We must build on that work in this Congress. So again, want to thank Representative Young Kim and Ami Bera for their leadership on this bill. Beijing's atrocities must be taken seriously, and we should do everything we can to address its horrible policies. Given the genocide taking place, H.R. 2766 calls for the creation of a special coordinator for Uyghur issues to promote, protect, and preserve the distinct ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic identities of the Uyghurs and other minority groups in Xinjiang. It also aims to ensure that the State Department and our diplomats have the tools they need to enhance our diplomatic efforts and programs in support of those suffering under Beijing's repression in Xinjiang. So, as I conclude, Mr. Chairman, I support this measure and urge all of my colleagues to do the same. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Kim is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Mix, for holding today's markup and for bringing up my legislation, H.R. 2766, the Uyghur Policy Act, for consideration today. I also want to thank the Ranking Member of the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee, Ami Bera, for partnering with me on this bipartisan legislation once again. This bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support last Congress. The People's Republic of China continues to deny carrying on genocide against the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, despite widely verified reports of forced sterilization, forced labor, brainwashing, and gang rape in detention camps. Unfortunately, this is not an issue that we can solve in the short time. Xi Jinping has shown no interest in working with the United States on human rights issues. Instead, the CCP cracks down on dissidents who draw attention to this genocide, even dissidents and Uyghurs living in the United States. The Uyghur Policy Act addresses several shortcomings in our existing policy regarding this genocide happening in Xinjiang. It authorizes the State Department to appoint a special coordinator on Uyghur policy issues, which will consolidate the State Department's diplomatic strategy so department-wide resources are better coordinated to respond to the Uyghur genocide. H.R. 2766 also directs the State Department to provide Uyghur language instruction at the Foreign Service Institute and station a Uyghur fluent officer at Mission China locations. This will enable our missions to show up and respond more effectively. This bill also authorizes support for Uyghur human rights activists and directs the U.S. Agency for Global Media to disseminate news and information regarding Uyghur genocide. We must leverage soft power to combat the CCP's massive misinformation campaign about the crimes against humanity it is carrying out in Xinjiang and garner international support for Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. Time is not on our side. Every day, the CCP gets closer to achieving its goal of wiping out Uyghur people and its culture. The time to act is now. So I want to thank the more than 100 co-sponsors of this bill on both sides of the aisle and the many advocacy organizations that helped to raise awareness about this legislation. I also want to thank Ranking Member Mix for working with me to ensure that we bring up an agreeable text. Thank you, and I urge my colleagues to support the ANS, and I yield the balance of my time.
Generally yields. Any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Wild is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of H.R. 2766, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor. Ensuring that our country stands for fundamental rights and dignity around the world really should not be a partisan issue, and I am proud that Republicans and Democrats have been so united in standing up for the Uyghur people in the face of the horrific persecution that they continue to face. Under Democratic and Republican chairs alike, this committee has worked with both the previous administration and the current administration to articulate the need for a clear and consistent position on this issue. As the representative of a district which counts constituents whose families have been directly affected by the barbaric tactics employed by the Chinese state to oppress communities in Xinjiang based on their faith and ethnic origin, I understand that this is not an issue that is just some bargaining chip in the global competition between the United States and China. It is deeply personal, and the lives of 1 million innocent people are hanging in the balance. Despite our best efforts in this chamber, much of the international community remains unwilling to stand up to the PRC and to speak out forcefully with actions, not just words, in opposition to these crimes against humanity. And while the previous and current administrations have both taken strong actions in defense of the Uyghur people, a great deal of work remains to be done. This past August, on the one-year anniversary of the report by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that documented many of the violations committed against the Uyghur people and which the PRC attempted to censor, Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director for China spoke out against much of the international community's inaction. She said, rather than urgently acting on the report's findings of serious violations of international law in China, the international community, including important components of the UN itself, has shied away from the kind of resolute steps needed to advance justice, truth, and reparation for victims. I echo that statement. The world cannot remain silent when faced with the suffering of so many. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation so that we can pass it on the floor of the House of Representatives and send an unequivocal message to the world, and that we will stand and will continue to stand in solidarity with the Uyghur people and all of those who are being persecuted by the PRC. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Generally yields. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me thank Chairwoman Young Kim for authoring this very, very important bill, the Uyghur Policy Act of 2023. Thank you for your leadership on this. It's very, very much needed. The bill supplements, as I think many of us know, both the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act passed in the last Congress and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, for which I was the lead Republican co-sponsor. I would note parenthetically, on April 18th, I chaired an oversight hearing of the China Commission looking at the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, and the administration, I think, is trying to do its level best, but there are many, many challenges because even with the rebuttable presumption provision of that law, the Chinese Communist Party is finding ways to circumvent it using the de minimis language in the law and other ways to get goods here that are being made in the concentration camps by Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang. It is important that we call on the government of the People's Republic of China and to call this for what it is. It is a genocide, and Ms. Kim's bill does just that. It also would create a special coordinator for Uyghurs issues at the State Department, something that I have long advocated for and even tried to pass when I sponsored an amendment to Chairman Meek's bill, the Eagle Act. I had an amendment that would have established a special envoy. Sadly, that bill did not become law, but I appreciate his efforts on that bill in the previous Congresses. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Xi Jinping, as we all know, the other night in San Francisco met with business leaders who paid $2,000 a plate for the opportunity to eat with someone responsible for a past, ongoing, and it looks like it's not going to, in any time soon, end genocide. We know there's something, there's a recording of him saying, and I've used it on the floor, when he said, show no mercy to the Uyghurs. Kill them, co-opt them, force them into labor camps, but show no mercy. Forced abortion, forced sterilization, and a whole host of other human rights abuses are being committed right up until this very moment, and yet these business leaders are paying mega dollars to, they gave him 2 standing ovations. He ought to be at The Hague for crimes against humanity and for genocide being prosecuted, not being feted the way he was. We cannot allow U.S. businesses to continue doing that, but this bill, again, will accelerate our efforts as a Congress, as a government, to try to mitigate the harm that's being suffered each and every day by these wonderful people in Xinjiang. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Waltz is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall distribute the amendment. Clerk shall report the amendment. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2766, offered by Mr. Waltz of Florida. Page 6, line 13, strike including and insert including. Page 6, line 13, strike Epker asset and all that follows through the end of the paragraph and insert the following. Ekper asset, who participated in the Department of State's International Visitors Leadership Program in 2016, was incarcerated after returning to XR and is now serving a 15-year prison sentence on charges of inciting ethnic hatred and ethnic discrimination.
Without objection, for the reading of the amendments, dispense with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman McCall, for the opportunity to speak on my amendment. I strongly support the underlying bill introduced by Representative Kim, and I thank her for her leadership on, both of you for your leadership on this important issue. And I certainly second Representative Smith's comments on the shameful and frankly disgusting behavior by our business leaders, literally bowing at the feet of a genocidal dictator and paying to do it. As a country that values human rights, it is our collective responsibility to ensure the Chinese Communist Party is held accountable for the human rights atrocities. It is, as we speak today, committing against the Uyghur population. The world must understand that millions of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang are being wrongfully detained, sent to concentration camps, forced into labor, gang raped, tortured, sterilized, and brainwashed as part of the Chinese Communist Party's attempts to ethnically cleanse their country. As we craft our foreign policy to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for these inhumane actions and seek to end this genocide, it is imperative that we, as U.S. leaders, continue to speak the names of those wrongfully detained. We must highlight their cases, we must put a spotlight on them, and call for their expedited release. My amendment does just that. This amendment is a simple yet important one, and that in addition to specifically calling for the release of Ekpar Assat, as written in the underlying bill, this amendment would include the names of 2 additional Uyghurs wrongfully detained in Xinjiang, Dr. Gulshan Abbas and Camille Wyatt. Dr. Abbas is a retired medical doctor and Uyghur who was wrongfully detained in Xinjiang on September 11th, 2018, and unjustly sentenced to 20 years in prison for no other reason than in retaliation for her sister's advocacy for Uyghur human rights. Dr. Abbas has more than 24 U.S. citizens as relatives currently living in the United States, including her daughters, Ziba Murat and Zamira Murat, who my office has personally worked with to advocate for their mother's release. Camille Wyatt is a university student in Uyghur who was wrongfully detained on December 12, 2022, after returning to Xinjiang while on break from studying in other parts of China. Camille's brother, Qusar Wyatt, is a Uyghur American currently living in the United States, and he too is a staunch Uyghur human rights advocate. This is a simple amendment that will put even more pressure on the CCP, again, by naming these individual cases and putting a spotlight on their wrongful detention, especially those who are family members of U.S. citizens. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Would my
Mr.
friend
Chairman.
yield? Would my friend yield?
Well, is there any further discussion on the
I'm at-
amendment? The
Chairman-
chair recognizes Mr. Connolly.
Okay. I don't need that much time, but I just wanted to thank my friend for his amendment. Happily support it, and I'm so glad he included the case of Dr. Abbas. Dr. Abbas has relatives in Virginia, including in my district. We have a robust Uyghur community, and we're very concerned about this. Senator Kaine of Virginia and myself wrote Secretary Blinken back in July about this case and about this, the number of Uyghurs who were detained, as my friend described. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that that letter of July 19th be entered into the record.
Without objection, so
I thank
ordered.
my friend, and I thank my friend for getting ready to yield.
So, gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Kim is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Mr. Walt's amendment naming and sharing the stories of 2 additional individuals who are victims of the Uyghur genocide. And I wish that we could name all of the individuals who have suffered in Xinjiang at the hands of CCP, but I'm afraid that the list would be too long to fit into this one bill. But I would like to use this opportunity, though, to draw attention to the persecution of the families of reporters at Radio Free Asia face for reporting on the Uyghur genocide. As you know, RFA's work is critical to sharing the truth of what's happening in Xinjiang. And according to RFA, 6 US-based Uyghur journalists have family members in the PRC who are missing, jailed, or detained, and this number of individuals is estimated to be more than 50. Shorat Hasor has worked at RFA for 15 years. He has 2 brothers who were sent to a re-education camp along with their wives and children and a number of extended family members. Mama John Juma has reported for RFA's Uyghur service for 12 years. His 2 brothers were thrown in prison after being questioned by authorities about their connection to Mr. Juma. Gulchera Hoja has reported for RFA for 18 years. She estimates that up to 24 of her family members are being held in re-education camps. Ms. Hoja has also been the target of a CCP smear campaign against Uyghurs involved and abroad. Jiryol Kawashgari has reported for RFA for 20 years. His sister-in-law and his brother were taken into custody, along with his cousins and nephews in 2017, and some of his family members have been released, but he still has brothers jailed. Asad Shalaimon has worked at RFA for 6 years. His 2 brothers, mother-in-law, and father-in-law were sent to a re-education camp. All of the previously mentioned reporters are U.S. citizens. In addition to these reporters, Korban Niaz is currently in the United States as an asylum seeker and has worked at RFA for 8 years. He has a brother who was arrested in 2017, and his 5-year sentence was extended to 15 years after he was supposed to be released in 2022. These cases of transnational repression show that these crimes against humanity are not confined to China's borders. The CCP targets American citizens who are brave enough to call out the CCP for this genocide. We must continue to raise awareness about this issue and garner international support for Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang and abroad who are targeted by the CCP. Thank you, and I yield back.
Generally yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Yeah, let me just say that I strongly support this amendment also. The number of people who have suffered under the PRC's repression is staggering, but the scale of the tragedy in Xinjiang demands that we remember the individual human lives that have been oppressed, detained, separated from their loved ones, tortured, and made to suffer in many other ways. These individuals are too many to name in this one bill, as indicated by other members. But I wholeheartedly support this amendment by Representative Walz as a way to highlight a few more of the innocent individuals who have been wrongfully detained and held captive by the PRC. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlemen, yield. Any further discussion on the amendment? I too support this amendment. There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Representative Walz, number 112. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is.
Chairman, may I ask on the recorded vote on this one, please?
On the amendment?
No, not on the amendment, on the bill.
Okay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? There being no further amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 2766 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Ms. Kim?
Yes, I would like to ask for a recorded vote on
Roll
this
call
one.
vote has been requested pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5375, strengthening the Quad Act. The bill is circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5375, to require a strategy for bolstering engagement and cooperation between the United States, Australia, India, and Japan to seek to establish a Quad intra-parliamentarian working group.
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, the Meeks Amendment number 51 in the nature of a substitute circulated to members in advance shall be considered as read and will be treated as original text for purposes of amendment. Is there any discussion on the bill? Ranking member, Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your work and working to collectively on this also. As I strongly support H.R. 5375, the Strengthening the Quad Act. You know, I've always said that we are stronger when we lead with diplomacy and work with our partners and our allies. This is especially true in the Indo-Pacific region, where America's presence, engagement, and alliance systems has maintained peace and stability for decades. Today, as the world and the region undergo rapid strategic and economic changes, it is critical that the United States upgrade our diplomatic and development efforts to showcase the United States leadership and deliver for the region. And that's why I'm thankful to President Joe Biden for elevating the Quad to the leaders level and supercharging Quad diplomacy. In less than 3 years, the leaders of the United States, Japan, and Australia, and India have held 5 Quad Leaders Summits to to chart cooperation to support the region's development, stability, and prosperity. As the Quad has evolved, it has expanded to new areas of cooperation. At the May 2023 Quad Leaders Summit in Hiroshima, the Quad nations agreed to enhance cooperation on infrastructure, investment, critical and emerging technologies, maritime issues, climate and energy, as well as other issues. And the Quad does so in ways that complement other multilateral groupings in the region, including ASEAN. The Quad is integral for a free and open Indo-Pacific, but it will only be successful if it has a clear, long-term strategy as well as political and institutional support in all four capitals. And this is why my bill calls for a Quad strategy that focuses on building democratic leadership in the region for the long term. But we need to maximize the Quad's effectiveness by making longer-term investments, engaging in sustained cooperation, and adapting our approach over time based on results. The strategy and report to Congress will allow successive administrations to chart long-term objectives and partner with Congress to best meet them. H.R. 5375 also calls for the creation of a Quad intra-parliamentary working group to facilitate engagement and cooperation among the legislative bodies of the four Quad democracies. Interparliamentary engagement would enhance legislative input and oversight and will help enhance the Quad's focus and effectiveness. It will also ensure that there is sustained support for the Quad in all four countries across political lines. Moreover, legislative input will also make it easier to adequately resource the Quad and equip it to deliver for the region. With an increasingly precarious and unstable Indo-Pacific region, the Quad is more important now than ever for upholding regional rules and helping maintain stability. This bill will ensure that the Quad is putting forward a positive and practical agenda for the region. And again, in talking about having the parliamentarian engagement, it gives us the opportunity. And I know, Mr. Chairman, you and I have sat in on some of the dinners where we've had conversations and working together in that regards. And then also meeting and working with some of our colleagues in the parliaments of these other countries. It enhances us working together. It makes sure that no matter, what administrations change or who the legislative branch is engaged also. So I thank you for your cooperation and working together. So I support this measure and urge all my colleagues to do the same. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I fully support this measure. I believe it's important not only for the executive branch to communicate, but the respective parliaments and the Congress. Any further discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you. I also am grateful for Mr. Meeks in bringing this forward, and I think it's about time Congress, in fact, take specific action with respect to the Quad. And I welcome this measure and gladly support it. I would note that for the Quad to be effective, we need partners who are making the serious investments in their own militaries to be a partner in the region. The Quad will not be effective if China has nothing to fear from. And maybe the word respect is better than fear. And we had a hearing a few months ago where some of the weaknesses in Australia's military really were highlighted. And so some of our partners need to be making investments, just like we've been making investments, in their region and in our military. They need to reciprocate. They need to do it too, because this has to be the partnership. That's the whole point of the Quad. It's not a unilateral American action. So I would hope that when this bill becomes law, we can use this platform on the parliamentary level anyhow in encouraging our colleagues in the other members of the Quad to make those investments, to support those investments, so that China understands what it has wrought. I thank my friend. I yield back.
Yields. And let me just add, it appears that our AUKUS measure will likely pass in the National Defense Authorization Bill. I want to thank the ranking member for working with me to get to this point. And I think that, of course, as you know, is the UK and Australia, but the Quad really complements that effort in a strong way. And so that's why I strongly support this bill. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Get a roll call vote.
Oh,
But we haven't done it.
oh, we're on amendments. Yeah. Any amendments? There being no amendments, I move that the committee report H.R. 5375 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Ask for a roll call
A
vote.
roll call vote has been requested pursuant to chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1103, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1103, to require the president to remove the extension of certain privileges, exemptions, and immunities to the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices if Hong Kong no longer enjoys a high degree of autonomy from the People's Republic of China, and for
Without objection, first reading is dispensed with. The bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Any discussion on the bill? Mr. Smith is recognized.
I do have an amendment in the issue of a substitute. Okay, I'll speak to it now.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
We like it.
I do want to thank you for including the bill in today's markup and for your strong support for it, as well as for Ranking Member Meeks. Hong Kong today is not the Hong Kong many of us knew, respected, and supported. We cherish the people, but it is the government that has become the severe oppressor of the people. The promise of one country, two systems, whereby Hong Kong would keep its distinct social and legal system for 50 years, following the 1997 handover from Great Britain, has proven to be a fiction. The Basic Law has been trashed, and I would remind members that the Basic Law reads like our Bill of Rights. The rights enumerated there are amazing, and the people of Hong Kong enjoyed those rights. Sometimes they were abrogated, but they did enjoy them to a large extent until now. Also, the Sino-UK Treaty has been abrogated with impunity. You know, that was a treaty that is binding. And so that international law has been violated by Xi Jinping and the Hong Kong authorities. Again, it's all been done in plain sight, and some of the best and the brightest and the bravest are now languishing in prison, including people like Joshua Wong, Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai, what an amazing man. He could have left. He was a publisher, as we all know, was a newspaper man, and you know, now he's in prison, and he will probably spend the rest of his life there. We had a hearing in April, and we heard from Sebastian Lai, his son, articulate, strong, powerful, courageous, and he made the case like no other on behalf of the people of Hong Kong and, of course, for his father. And we have a situation where people just look askance and say, well, maybe we can do business again in Hong Kong. It has changed radically, and people who do business there, who happen to be Americans or corporate types, they better take notice, because at a twinkling of an eye, they can find themselves in a very, very bad situation. About 1,000 political prisoners, there's more than that, but these are people who are absolutely committed to nonviolence, who are being tortured by the Hong Kong police, and of course, all of this being promoted by Xi Jinping. The Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices, or for short, HKETOs, were given the status akin to an embassy, and with privileges and immunities on the assumption that Hong Kong would retain, I say again, retain, a degree of autonomy from Communist China. They have now, however, become 3 additional hostile Chinese outposts in the United States. From these HKETOs, located in Washington, New York, and San Francisco, we have seen an extension of the PRC's long-arm transactional repression, including harassment of Hong Kong democracy advocates living in exile here in the United States. Anna Kwok, who's here with us today, and thank you for your extraordinary bravery. She's the executive director of the Hong Kong Democracy Council. She testified at our hearing of the China Commission, and she told us how her team was questioned, or the Chinese officials, the Keto officials, questioned her team, and there was one of the 8 democracy advocates of whom the Hong Kong government placed, she is one of them, $1 million bounty for their return to face political persecution in Hong Kong. I mean, in the light of day, here they are operating in the United States. It is time that their doors be shuttered. We just saw the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, meeting conclude in San Francisco the week before last, where China had 2 votes, not 1, 2, its own and Hong Kong's. Hong Kong's financial minister, Paul Chan, was present at APEC, though thankfully Chief Executive John Lee, who has been sanctioned by the United States for his dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong, did not show up. But regardless of who was the front man, the reality is that Xi Jinping is calling the shots. And the notion that Hong Kong was an independent actor at this gathering is about as credible as the days of the Soviet Union, when it had 3 votes at the United Nations General Assembly, its own, plus that of Ukraine and Belarus, Soviet socialist republics. Thus, the timeliness of moving this bill at this junction is that Congress is sending a message. We see through the charade. The bill will authorize the president to end the privileges and immunities of HKITOs now enjoy and force them to either fold or reconstitute themselves as an NGO, thereby taking away the diplomatic shield they now hide behind when they are harassing Hong Kong democracy activists living in the U.S. It would further prevent the U.S. government entities from contracting with HKITOs, putting a stop to debacles such as the one that took place in September of last year, whereby the Smithsonian Institute hosted a gala called Classy, Sassy, Jazzy Hong Kong Night, effectively enabling HKITO propaganda to employ, aimed at showing the world that business had returned to normal in Hong Kong, when in reality, press freedom and democracy advocates, like I said, Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong, were languishing in prison. Finally, the bill would update and restate our policy vis-a-vis Hong Kong. I would like to thank the committee staff, both Democrat and Republican, in particular Anna Kowalski, Chris White, who worked on this ANS with us, and let me just remind members, this is not only a bipartisan bill. Jim McGovern's the chief co-sponsor of it. It's also bicameral. Senator Merkley and others have also joined on the Senate side. So it's an effort that's totally bipartisan, bicameral. And again, I want to thank Scott Flipsy, Andy Wong, Pierre Tozzi, who's right behind me, who's our general counsel and chief of staff for the China Commission. This is an idea whose time has come, and let's empower the president to be able to do this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me thank you, Mr. Smith, for bringing this bill forward. I was astounded to learn that these offices were still in existence in the United States, and they're really a propaganda piece for the CCP. So thank you for calling this excellent bill to our attention. Any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, I absolutely join in the sentiments expressed by my friend from New Jersey, and I thank him for bringing the bill forward. I mean, Hong Kong was one of the most vibrant, exciting, successful places on the planet. It merged cultures. It fostered entrepreneurship. It was an entrepot for the whole of Asia, and a beautiful place to see physically. And it took the Chinese Communist Party to squelch all that, to suppress it, to turn back the clock, and in doing so, abrogating and violating a treaty it agreed to in 1997 with a handover. And China has no one to blame but itself with respect to Taiwanese alienation from the one China, two systems policy espoused previously that has been abrogated and abandoned today. Taiwan looks at what happened in Hong Kong as the exemplar, and it is not reassuring. And China has, as I said, no one to blame but itself for its own behavior. And I think we have to respond, and we have to keep Hong Kong in the spotlight because it is such a special place. And we know from protests, we know from the courage my friend described of men and women who are in prison simply because they defend the freedom promised in the 1997 agreement. So I think that's an important step, and I hope this committee and I hope Congress will continue to keep Hong Kong in the forefront. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the bill? There being no further discussion, are there any amendments? The committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Mr. Smith is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in nature of a substitute.
Clerk shall distribute the amendment.
And would just say to my colleagues, I want to thank both the Democrat and the Republican side. We worked very cooperatively on this, and I think there's no remaining issues whatsoever. So this amendment, I think, should hopefully garner the support of everyone. I would ask that, Mr. Chairman, a letter signed by 30 Hong Kong human rights and democracy organizations in support of this bill be made a part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield back.
And the clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1103, offered by Mr. Smith of New Jersey. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited.
Without objection, further reading of the amendments dispensed with. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I've stated, I think, the case. I yield back, and I just ask for support.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seek recognition? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support the ANS to the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act. The whole world has watched as Beijing undid the one country, two systems framework that guaranteed autonomy to Hong Kong. In doing so, Beijing failed to live up to its commitments under the Sino-British Joint Declaration and to the people of Hong Kong. Since June 2020, China, through its draconian national security law, has essentially revoked Hong Kong's autonomy. We have seen authorities crack down on free speech, free press, and free association. Hong Kong courts are no longer independent. Some judicial cases are now tried in mainland China, while some trials are held behind closed doors. We've also seen intimidation and rampant digital surveillance of journalists and activists, and the arrest of anyone who dares to express their opposition to Beijing's repressive policies. According to the Hong Kong Democracy Council, as of last week, there were 1,732 political prisoners in the city. Under these circumstances, it is very hard to see Hong Kong as autonomous in any credible way. Currently, Hong Kong economic and trade offices operate as official representative offices of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, enjoying a series of privileges, exemptions, and immunities. The United States granted Hong Kong these privileges based on Hong Kong's distinct autonomous status. Given the rampant repression we've seen under the national security law, it makes sense to revisit whether Hong Kong officials should continue to retain such privileges. This bill calls on the President to determine whether such privileges should be extended or revoked. Hong Kong should only benefit from having a status distinct from China internationally if it is truly autonomous from the PRC at home. And so while I am generally supportive of this measure, I'm concerned that we could inadvertently be playing into Beijing's hand by helping shut the door on Hong Kong's return to autonomy. It is my hope that the majority would have accepted more of our suggested edits to address these concerns. If the Hong Kong economic and trade offices are eventually shut down, I hope this can be done in a way that doesn't help Beijing consolidate control over the political and economic governance and international relations of Hong Kong. But given the terrible state of human rights in Hong Kong and the blatant disregard for Hong Kong's autonomy by Beijing, I do support the ANS. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Anybody else like to be heard? If not, there be no further discussion. Do any members wish to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If not, okay. There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Okay. There be no further amendments. I move that the committee report H.R. 1103 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. The legislation is agreed to. Now, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and is agreed to. And I would ask for a roll call. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Anything else? Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5532, the Russia-North Korea Cooperation Sanctions Act. The bill was circulated in advance. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5532, to provide for the imposition of sanctions with respect to North Korea's support for Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open to an amendment at any point. Is there any discussion on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
would you like me to move the amendment, the ANS now?
Well, if we could just hold off.
Of course.
Mr. Wilson wanted, he's very late for a 1 minute on the floor, so then I'll go right to you. Chair recognizes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm especially grateful to serve as co-lead on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly President Jerry Connolly's Russia-North Korea Cooperation Sanctions Act. This bill expands sanctions on North Korea and war criminal Putin as they reveal the new axis of evil. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is murderous, and North Korea should not provide munitions to war criminal Putin without consequences. Reports are of trained convoys from North Korean dictatorship to the oppressive Russian dictatorship of 155 millimeter artillery rounds to murder Ukrainian citizens. Dictator Kim has produced the world's largest inventory of artillery to intimidate Seoul and the people of South Korea as the North Korean people actually starve themselves. Ukrainian victory will show how rule of law democracies prevail over dictators which preserve their rule by rule of gun, oppressing the people of Russia. North Korea dictator Kim Jong-un aspires to join Putin, the Iranian regime, and the Chinese Communist Party axis of evil, working to destroy freedom and democracy around the world. Kim is developing intercontinental ballistic missiles to attack Japan and America. As the only member of Congress serving today who has visited Pyongyang, I saw firsthand the brutal dictatorship oppressing the people of North Korea, threatening the thriving democracy of South Korea. In fact, the dictatorship in North Korea has reduced the per capita income of the citizens of North Korea to $967, as South Korea has a per capita income of over $30,000. Evil working to must be addressed. This bill ensures that the aspiring dictator Kim can neither profit nor aid and abet war criminal Putin's mass murder of innocent Ukrainians before he ever joins as a supplicant puppet in the axis of evil. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and hold North Korea responsible for conspiring with war criminal Putin. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. There being no further discussion of the bill, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk in the nature of a substitute.
The chair will distribute the Connolly amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, while we're waiting for distribution, I just want to clarify, this amendment in the nature of substitute will ensure that assistance Russia provides North Korea for its space, nuclear, or ballistic missiles programs is included in the sanctions covered by this bill.
Great, thank you. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5532, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Russia-North Korea Cooperation Sanctions Act. Section 2.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks for bringing forward this important legislation. And I want to thank my friend Joe Wilson for his friendship and cooperation and collaboration on this bill. On September 13th, Kim Jong-un traveled to meet with Vladimir Putin in the far eastern Russian region of Amur. As Kim and Putin lauded each other with accolades of comrade, they reportedly discussed the war in Ukraine and possible Russian technical assistance for launching a North Korean spy satellite. Kim Jong-un's support during the summit of totalitarian autocrats was unvarnished. Raising a glass, Kim remarked, quote, "The Russian army and people will certainly win a great victory in the sacred struggle for the punishment of a great evil that claims hegemony and feeds an expansionist delusion. This delusion, shared by the two delusional, repressive, depraved authoritarians, aims to punish Ukraine for the sin of simply seeking to be a free people. That cannot be a sin here, nor in Ukraine, nor anywhere else in the world. Some pundits and far-right politicians have disingenuously argued that the conflict in Ukraine is just a simple territorial dispute from which the United States must abstain. That's wrong. The stakes are truly about the future of democratic values, ways of life that infuse the human spirit with freedom, versus the alternative, the absolute suppression of those same freedoms. Just months after the summit, reports confirmed our suspicions about that meeting. North Korea delivered more than 1,000 containers of military equipment and munitions to resupply Russia. It estimated that North Korea sent up to 1 million rounds of ammunition and shells to Russia to rain down on Ukrainian people. South Korea's military has publicly confirmed that the DPRK has also likely supplied several types of missiles to Russia for its use against the Iranian people. While unsurprising that Kim Jong-un would find common cause with a fellow sociopath in Vladimir Putin, the United States must immediately create real costs for this unseemly material support. That's why I authored the North Korea-Russia Cooperation Sanctions Act, legislation that will require targeted economic and visa blocking sanctions to be implemented on any foreign person or entity that is responsible for or facilitates the transfer of, sale of arms or material support from North Korea to be used in Russia's depraved and illegal war in Ukraine. Not only do these arms shipments undermine peace and security in Europe on the footsteps of our NATO allies, they contravene United Nations Security Council Resolution 1874, which prohibits such arms trading with North Korea. The Biden administration has taken swift action to sanction 3 entities tied to the sanctions evasion network attempting to support arms deals between Russia and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The legislation would support those efforts and ensure the Departments of Treasury and State have the requisite authority, statutory authority, to do all we can to stymie such shipment of arms. Our efforts, if they're successful, could mean Ukrainian lives are saved on the battlefield. This bill expands the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act of 2016 to ensure that along with releasing all political prisoners, ceasing its censorship of peaceful political activity, and dismantling the nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological weapons systems, North Korea must also halt material support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Of course, I was proud to support a humanitarian exception in the North Korean Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act of 2016, and our legislation includes such an exception as well to ensure that the United States can continue to support the North Korean people and their aspirations for democracy, human rights, and basic dignity. On November 21, with the help of Russia, North Korea launched its first spy satellite, its third attempt after 2 failed previous tries. North Korea's state media has already claimed Kim Jong-un has received satellite images of the White House and the Pentagon. The Russian-North Korean Cooperation Sanctions Act imposes sanctions on any individual who's responsible for or facilitates the provision of economic assistance and technical support to the North Korean space, nuclear, or ballistic missile programs. There must be no equivocation in the response from the United States. People are dying in Ukraine as we speak for daring to embrace the democratic ideal we propound, we hold dear. We must not allow authoritarianism to extinguish the flame of that hope and that democracy in Ukraine or anywhere else. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any other members seek recognition? Mr. Bear is recognized. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Mr. Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague and good friend from Virginia for his leadership on H.R. 5532, the Russia-North Korea Cooperation Sanctions Act. This bill is critical to ensuring that Russia and the DPRK's leadership or partnership does not go unchecked, and I urge all my colleagues to vote for this. I'd also like to briefly speak on 2 bills that were brought up earlier. H.R. 5375, the Strengthening the Quad Act. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Meeks, for his leadership on this incredibly important bill. When we think about our Indo-Pacific strategy, when we think about maritime security, freedom of navigation, and the rule of law, strengthening the Quad will empower the Secretary of State to develop a Quad strategy, really to build a leadership in the Indo-Pacific on the shared interests and challenges that we have. And again, I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Meeks, for his leadership on that bill. I also would like to thank the chairwoman on the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee, Chairwoman Kim, for her leadership on H.R. 2766, the Uyghur Policy Act of 2023. This is an incredibly important legislation to make sure we uphold our values, to make sure we have a special coordinator for Uyghur issues within the State Department, and understand the importance of continuing to keep this issue on the front plate. I also want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Meeks, and Chairman McCall for their support of this important bill, which I was proud to be a co-lead on. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this bipartisan bill and ANS and thank Representative Connolly for his leadership on this issue and his continued work to support the people of Ukraine against Russia's brutal war. Russia's renewed invasion has caused reverberations across the world, affecting the world's energy and grain markets and making crystal clear the Kremlin's intentions. In response, the United States has led through its revitalized alliances and partnerships to impose severe costs on Russia and strengthen those relationships with friends of freedom and democracy. And as a result, and thanks to Ukrainian resilience and bravery, the Russia war machine has been degraded. Russia can no longer count on its dwindling number of partners to fulfill its war demand, to find spare parts, and has been forced to look to other sources, notably North Korea. This timely bill seeks to close that spigot as well. Importantly, it requires the administration to impose sanctions on any foreign person or institution supporting the concealing military pathway from North Korea to Russia's war in Ukraine. And as the war evolves, so should our economic strategy to help Ukraine win. Knowing that Russia is scrambling to find parts and other sources of military material, this is an important bipartisan step in that direction. And finally, I look forward to the ability to vote for the next Ukraine supplemental that is so desperately needed. They are about out of resources now. So I hope that happens very, very soon. Our partners and allies are watching. The Ukrainians who have showed us all that freedom and democracy is worth protecting will continue to fight, but are watching. And finally, the Kremlin and others that doubt American leadership are also watching. So we must act, and we must act now. It is urgent. The urgency is now. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields any further discussion. Let me say I agree 100% with the ranking member's comments. And when I got the reports that Mr. Putin was going to North Korea hat in hand to beg him for weapons because he's running out, and yet we cannot make that decision in the Congress to fully arm and fund and back Ukraine, a democracy against Putin's aggression, in light of his embracement of Hamas in the Kremlin. What more evidence do we need? You know, it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all together in this against the free world in the West. It's very simple to me. What's at stake here? I think the free world is at stake, and the United States needs to lead. You know, I don't know about the two of you, but Reagan, you know, I grew up as a Reaganite, and what would Reagan do? The guy who defeated the Soviet Union, would he stand down? And if we abandon our NATO allies, what then? What message does that send to our enemies? It only emboldens and empowers our enemies. And as Mr. Putin has said, within 1 week, he will take over Ukraine. And then what? Then he advances his aggression. And then they see the United States as withdrawing from our commitments, our responsibilities, and that we're weak as a superpower. We're no longer leading the free world, but shrinking from that very responsibility that many of our great presidents have stood for, you know, both on the Democrat and Republican side. I remember John F. Kennedy talking about this, to President Reagan. There should be no partisanship to this issue. It should be American. And I really thank the gentleman for bringing this measure forward. And with that, is there any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, if you just yield for 1 second.
I yield.
I can't thank you enough, and Mr. Meeks enough, for the sentiments you've expressed. I had the privilege of joining you and Mr. Meeks when he was chairman a few days after the invasion. And we saw collectively the human cost.
Absolutely.
There were 22,000 people across that border that day we were there, and there were 6 such border crossings. And we saw women, when an airplane went over, crouch because they thought it was going to bomb them. That's the trauma they had just been through. And that was the beginning of this war. And the chairman it couldn't be more correct. Ronald Reagan must be turning over in his grave when he hears some of his fellow colleagues who express misgivings or doubts or downright opposition to America standing tall with a country that's a former Soviet satellite seeking to join the West in the democratic freedoms we espouse. And so I thank the chairman for his leadership, particularly on his side of the aisle. He's been forthright, he's been consistent, and we had the privilege of being there at the very beginning and understanding, I think, that you've got to translate policy into human terms. And there are real human beings paying a terrible price. And we cannot be sidelined in that enterprise. We just cannot. So I thank my friend.
Thank the gentleman. I also recall this man saying, how can one man do this? And that echoed with me. And, you know, at the end of the day, we're on the right side of history.
No question.
And Poland, I remember the Poles saying, this reminds me of 1939 all over again. And the parallels to my father's war, World War II, are absolutely there. And if we fail to act now, we will see that aggression take place as my father's generation saw. So thank you for those kind words. And is there any further discussion? There being no further discussion, do any members wish to offer an amendment to the Connolly Amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Connolly. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I move that the committee report H.R. 5532 is amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair,
Mr.
the ayes
Chairman.
have it. The motion is agreed to. Gentleman from
Mr.
Virginia
Chairman,
is recognized.
On that, I would also ask for a recorded vote.
Roll call vote has been requested
thank the
pursuant
chair.
to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. This committee will stand in recess. We will reconvene following votes on the House floor at approximately 2 p.m.